Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're so excited. April is all about youth today for the Capacity Building Institute. I'm so happy that you're here. We're going to meet some of our great guests in a minute. We're starting to see all of you roll in. As you know, if you've been here before, one of my favorite things is to find out where everybody's coming from. I'm coming from beautiful Ottawa today on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people. If you would like to share where you're coming from, we'd like to see that too. So feel free to share in the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. We've had people from Victoria to Charlottetown to New Zealand and everywhere in between. So we've got Cochrane, Alberta today, Treaty 7. Thank you so much, Vanessa. We've got lots to cover. I don't want to waste 1 second today. I'm going to hand it over to the lovely Hannah Rockburn, who is the glue that keeps us together. And Hannah's going to take you through some important information, and then we'll get right into engaging youth. So stay with us, everyone. Over to you, Miss Hannah.
Thank you, Sam. That's awesome. I'm just going to unpin. So welcome everyone. As Sam has introduced, I'm Hannah Rockburn. I am the operations manager here at the Capacity Building Institute. And I'm just going to do a quick little presentation for those who may not be as familiar with us before we get into our awesome topic today. So the Capacity Building Institute, we are a nonprofit organization based here out of Ottawa, and we provide training, coaching, and mentorship support to staff and volunteers in the environmental nonprofit sector all across Canada. And our mission for our organization is to provide equal opportunity and access to capacity building training for every small shop environmental nonprofit leader across Canada. We focus on 6 main core capacity building themes. So we cover financial management, fund development, governance and board development, volunteer engagement, human resources, communications and outreach, risk management and legal issues, as well as leadership and organizational culture. And we hit on all these topics with a variety of different types of programs. So we have our program that we usually have tonight, our webinar series, where we have guest speakers come in from the sector to talk all about different of these building capacity topics for EDs, leaders, volunteers, and all different perspectives. That happens free once a month or the fourth Wednesday of every month for us to join. We also have our capacity building certificate program. So this is like a 6-month boot camp for executive directors and program coordinator leaders. And then we also have like the light version of that. So the internship support program or training program, which is more for youth that are under the age of 30 that are just entering the sector and kind of want to learn a little bit more about the governance and the way that nonprofits work. And then we're also piloting right now an Engaging Senior Leaders program, which is almost like a board 101 training where we're getting seniors involved in a nonprofit, joining a board of directors, as well as then giving them some coaching and training on what they can do as board members to help support the organizations that they're volunteering with. And for our CBCP program, as well as the ITP, registration is open. So if you are interested in either sending an intern or maybe going through some training yourself, the registration is open and those classes start in June. So we would love to hear from you. I can talk with you and we'll set up a meeting if that's something that you would like to join this year. We have amazing trainers that help us put together these programs. So we have Sam, who's our host tonight. We also have Rob, Barb, and Alex. And we also, as some of you have heard from, Dwayne is helping out with our training and joining our group of leaders this year as well. And they all have lots of years of experience in the sector and a variety of different topics to enrich the course. And I just wanted to thank some of our funders, our partners. Without their support and their resources, we would not be able to run these programs as well as we can. So we're very thankful for the resources and funding that they provide for our programming. If you'd like to have a chat with me or learn more about any of the stuff that I quickly touched on tonight, you can email us at info@capacitybuilding.ca. You can reach out to us on our website. You can give us a phone call. Or if you happen to be in the Ottawa area, we do have a shared office space on Billings Avenue. You're more than welcome to come in and say hi. We're here Monday to Thursday. And then our next save the date for capacity is May 22nd from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern time. We are going to be doing a theme this year on a lot of fundraising, fund development topics for 2024. So we will be bringing back Kristen Tully, who we've had here in the past, and she will be talking about fundraising and fund development topics for next month, and we'll be keeping that theme up for the year. So I highly recommend for you guys to sign up and register on our website for the upcoming webinars to be able to touch on some fundraising tips and tricks and advice throughout the year this year. And with that, I will send it back to Sam.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that very much, Hannah. Today's all about engaging youth. I'm so excited to welcome to our webinar today. Paul Seale is here, as well as Aditi Basdeo. Hello to you both. How are you? Lovely to
Really
have you
great.
both here.
Yeah, great. And really grateful for the opportunity. Thanks so much for the invitation.
And Aditi, I understand you're coming to us from a very special place today.
Yeah, yes. I'm as I finished off my third year of university and I'm heading over to France. I stopped off in Portugal for a bit. So doing some traveling and some learning along the way.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to ask Paul to start. Tell us a little bit about your background, Paul, and then we can hear from Aditi a little bit, and then we'll dive right in.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess in the context, I should start with saying like I was a youth once too, but I'm not anymore. I've had a long kind of multi-sectoral career. I've been an archivist and an activist and a restaurateur, and everything I do is touched by community development and sort of citizen engagement. So I remain really, really interested in helping people to identify opportunities for involvement in their own governance, and volunteerism is one of the models that we have for that. I work now for, I'm really lucky actually. My day job aligns perfectly with my personal mission. I work as the manager of public policy and advocacy for Pillar Nonprofit Network. We're also a nonprofit capacity building organization. And we're dedicated to to enhancing the operational capabilities of the impact sector with nonprofits and social purpose businesses, and particularly seek cross-sectoral solution making. So we sort of build up nonprofits, and part of that capacity building for nonprofits is learning how to better and more equitably engage the community, including the youth community.
That's wonderful. Aditi, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So first off, I'm a student. I'm in my third year, as I mentioned. I study chemical engineering and business. Um, so not fields that you traditionally think about being connected to social activism, but I see so many ties nowadays. And as the industries are shifting more so towards the environment, I just see so much alignment between engineering and business. But my journey into the social innovation space started in 2018 when I started my very first nonprofit called Champions of Change Canada. And that was entirely focused on activating youth to manage fundraisers, campaigns, educational conferences, all focused on gender equality. And really, it was about creating this sense of friendship and community, and quickly grew to be a global initiative. We had chapters in Bangladesh, across Canada, and interest from South America, all over the world. People were tuning in. And so it was really a transformative experience for me. Number one, engaging with young people, but being able to share my message and my voice on such a global scale. And that is kind of somehow how I interacted with Pillar Nonprofit Network, just through some meandering paths. And then I started working there, helping to train young people on this idea of social enterprise, and that you can kind of pair like businesses, traditional for-profit businesses, with the kind of the purpose-driven mission that a lot of charities have. And so I did some work with Pillar for a while. And now I'm working with a startup in the impact investment space, and we do a lot of work with environmental organizations to help get them financing through crowd lending. So lots of different experiences, but all really rooted in the social and environmental activism space.
Well, you've both inspired me already, so let's dive right in. This is such an important topic, and I think more than ever, what youth can bring to the table, particularly regarding volunteerism. I mean, I think before the pandemic, it was certainly a very important topic. Coming out of this pandemic, and seeing really the need for volunteers more than ever. Talk to me a little bit about how things have changed, Paul, in the last couple of years.
Yeah, so I love that framing actually, because when Aditi and I present more formally on this, uh, I usually sort of start by laying out the kind of ecosystem challenges, and I always start with another person who was a youth once upon a time, but not when he was famous. But that Milton Friedman quote that kept popping up during the pandemic when people were talking about economic measures and whether we were going to see just transition or if we were trying to get back to normal. Where he says that only in a crisis do you get real change, and you get real change by latching on to ideas that were kind of lying around waiting for their opportunity. And I think that it's really appropriate to this subject, because I think that heading into sort of well before the pandemic, not just sort of immediately pre-pandemic. I mean, I think nonprofits generally and the community generally, has a good understanding that the youth are our future, and it's important to engage them, and that they should have an active role in choosing the kind of world that they're going to live in. Um, but it was an idea that was kind of laying around without a lot of competencies attached to it. And it wasn't necessarily done well, which is not to say that some organizations didn't do it masterfully. Um, but I think that there was a kind of lack of competencies about this. So, well, how do you genuinely, meaningfully engage youth in a way that does give them the power to, of governance over their futures? And so those ideas were kind of laying around, and it's people like Aditi. I mean, it'll be no secret by the end of this, I'm a huge admirer, and so feel grateful that I've had the opportunity to work with her and learn from her. But it is people like Aditi who are articulating like what that actually looks like, and maybe what it feels like, from the youth perspective. What does it feel like to be engaged? What is that? And what conditions then for the nonprofit organization that's trying to engage them? What conditions do you need to meet in order to create the opportunity for those feelings? And then I'll say more granularly, that ecosystem that we talked about, like what are the challenges? What is the crisis? Well, I mean, the volunteer ecosystem sort of crumbled during the pandemic for a whole lot of very specific reasons. We know that like volunteer administrators and volunteer coordinators were among the very first people that nonprofits had to lay off or redeploy, because we know that also that that seniors in our ecosystem are the super volunteers. So it's actually the case that more Gen Z people as a proportion of that demographic volunteer than any other demographic, which is great news. But the super volunteers who are actually putting in the bulk of the hours were retirees who had the time to do that. And when they went home and in-person programming went home, the volunteer administrators also had to go home. So there's been a disruption in the capacity of organizations who are just now rehiring. And then, sort of throughout that, we know that, Volunteer Canada reported that 65% of organizations were experiencing difficulty recruiting volunteers, 35% couldn't retain volunteers. The ONN reported similar kinds of numbers. Stats Can reported that workers were burning out because they were doing things that used to be volunteer functions on top of their own work. And so the labor force was actually suffering because of the breakdown in volunteerism. And so, and we know this, like that, seniors who might have retired in the years during the pandemic, like a lot of them just aren't coming back. They're retired now. There's 3 years of natural succession that didn't happen. And they would have been part of how we onboarded new volunteers, recruited and onboarded new volunteers. They're just gone. So, there's a kind of argument in again, when we present more formally, that says, like, youth volunteers is also what you've got. Like, it's what's available. And if you want to have a volunteer workforce of any sort, it's going to include youth on aggregate. But it's a better way to go into this, to recognize that kind of right of youth to be engaged in their own world.
Yeah.
and to be able to articulate how they'd like to be engaged.
Yeah, beautifully answered. Thank you so much, Paul. And Aditi, when I think about youth and I think about volunteering, and many of us, I'm too old to have been part of this, but many of us know that our children now are required to do that 40 hours of volunteering. But so many youth are doing so much more than that. Talk to me a little bit about the collation between sort of that being something that's in the school system, but something that is based also in just values maybe from family or from community.
Yeah, I've been in quite a few conversations around this 40 hours requirement, whether it's a good or a bad thing, and how it almost exacerbates challenges for youth who are underserved and marginalized. Because what we saw from running youth programming is the youth who are able to dedicate more time and come out more and do different types of activities that take up those hours beyond the 40 are often not the youth who are having to work to support their families, having to work to support themselves. And so there's an equity role that comes into play when you think about this 40 hours required through high schools. And so there's a bit of a tension that I'm always conscious of when I think about the 40 hours requirement and when I think about volunteerism. Um, Equity is a huge thing. I think a lot of the time we, as organizations, don't dedicate enough resources to supporting volunteers, and we don't realize there's a very clear division between what should be volunteer work and what should be paid work. And I think that's another important distinction to make is that uh, a lot of the time volunteers should be rewarded through some sort of financial mechanism. And especially if you're looking to achieve certain like EDI objectives, or if that's a core part of your mission. And I know a lot of almost all the organizations here are seeking to change environmental conditions and
Mhm.
activate change in the environmental space. And so in order to do that, I only see an equitable solution being possible. And so that spans not just how you advocate for the environment, but how you enable pathways for all different forms of youth to engage. And so I really look at this from an equity perspective. But beyond that, in a broader sense, I also think that when youth are told, like, you only have to volunteer for these 40 hours, you also get a lot of young people who are just getting those 40 hours done, just want to get it out of the way. And so, us as organizations, it's really important that we try to create opportunities where they can see volunteering as more than just a
Mhm.
box to check off their list, as something that can be a career for them, that can inform their projection in terms of post-secondary career paths further down the line, their use of their free time, and really try to embed the values that we as nonprofits, charities, social enterprises have in the minds of young people. And now I say that, and then there's also a lot of young people nowadays who are going beyond that 40 hours because they are so passionate. And so it's important to make a distinction between all the different groups. And so you get these young people who have the time, who have the privilege, and who are extremely passionate about environmental causes and about social activism. And there really is a shift, I think, in terms of how we use our voice, considering social media and digitalization. A lot of young people are able to reach mass amounts of audiences in a very fast-paced way, and so it's interesting the dynamic there as well is how we use our voice. And I think our generation is one that just does so a lot more than past generations, especially on things like climate, which are going to impact us the most, and we're going to be most vulnerable to that impact. And to me, it all comes back to equity as well. The youth who are going to be most impacted 10, 20, 30 years down the line are also the ones who are most marginalized today and who live in impoverished communities who don't have access to proper education, resources, infrastructure. And so it's kind of this giant ecosystem that of interconnected issues. But yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about around the 40 hours and the youth who go beyond that. But I definitely think you'll see a shift in the generation today of a lot of youth who are very passionate and have a lot to say.
Mhm.
And you need to create those pathways to help them use their voice.
Well, it's funny because you just brought up about five things I never thought of. So thank you for that. I'm all about learning today too. My daughter's 16, so she's she's well on her way with her hours, but I do see people struggle with this. And you brought up a couple of points very much so that weren't on my radar. So I'm sure I'm not the only one. Paul, when we think about, the numbers and the roles that we provide for volunteers, particularly youth, in this country, what mostly are youth participating in?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I'm going to start because this is, the space that I work in. I'm just a policy geek. Um, I'm going to start with, I think I'm picking up the very first, very first bit of this was from, the things that Aditi was saying about the 40-hour requirement, which is, and I've got that experience too, Sam. I've got grown children now, like they're 28 and 25, and they grew up in an engaged household. They grew up with a governance and belonging geek as a dad. And so, they'd acquired, 200 volunteer hours, before they entered their final year. And that wasn't really like a challenge for them. And they were doing volunteer hours before they knew it was called volunteering. It was just called helping dad. So, but, I think that the thing that maybe we're not, and when I say we, I mean, my generation, I think Aditi knows this from experience, not necessarily from the data, but the thing that maybe we're not getting, those of us who are sort of desperate to find a way to engage youth, but aren't really in that generation and aren't thinking the same way, is the degree to which they're really making informed choices. So that doesn't speak to, like what subsectors are they interested in. I think that we know that young people are really interested in climate issues and environmental issues. They're really interested in sustainability in sort of a big way. I've got a daughter who's now, a professional, public relations account manager, but her pathway in was helping a friend with her sustainable fashion brand, when she was younger. And so I think we know that sort of thing. The thing that I think was really interesting, again, going back to data, was so Volunteer Canada already has, so people watching, given the timing of this, may know that Volunteer Canada efforts to create a national action strategy for volunteerism was just funded in the most recent budget, which is really great news. Volunteer Canada was already working with the Rito Hall Foundation on a national action strategy for youth volunteerism that was funded by the foundation, so it wasn't dependent on that government funding. And that project started in, I think it was 2021. It was a couple of years ago, or a few years ago now. And they did surveys of young people sort of the ages 16 to 24, but also of 12 to 15-year-olds, right? So people like on the precipice of their high school education and then into the first couple of years of high school. And it was sort of an interesting division that really does speak to sort of what we think of as children and what we think of as youth or young adults, rather than dividing at the high school line and sort of making a lot of that, right? And one of my favorite sort of data points out of this is that when they asked 12 to 15-year-olds if they were interested in civic engagement, about 2/3 said yes, like 69%, I think, which is like, that's okay. But what was really interesting is when they gave them a list, they didn't really know what civic engagement meant, though, right? That wasn't a current term in their parlance. But if they gave them a list of 6 specific types of civic engagement, like community service and indirect political involvement and things like that, then it went up to like 87% of youth and 89% of children were interested in at least one of those things. So I think that, to me, what it says is, young people are prepared to make informed choices if we're prepared to inform them. If we're prepared to invite their knowledgeable and discerning sense of what they'd like to do, they're more likely to say yes than if we give them an invitation to engage in something very loose and not very well defined. That's not meeting them where they are or not meeting them where they want to be. I don't want to go do something ill-defined. I want to do something that I understand, that's concrete to me, um, where I can see the connection to meaningful impact in my community. Um, so I don't know if that's the kind of answer you're expecting, but as I said, I think I think we know that young people love working with other young people.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to volunteer at camps. Um, and as I said, we know that it's a green generation that cares about the climate, and they're
For
gonna
sure.
they're gonna show up in those spaces when we're thinking granularly. But I think more generally, they're gonna show up when people can make it clear to them that it's an invitation to have an impact,
Right.
in a very specific sort of way. And
Mm-hmm.
and Aditi, I think, as I said, knows what that feels like better than I can convey.
Yeah, beautifully said. And Aditi, let me ask you this, and I've seen this time and time again. I've worked in nonprofits for a very long time, and I've seen this with lots of volunteers, particularly with youth. I think we do them a really disservice when we don't onboard volunteers well. And I think there's a lot to be said about a strong onboarding process that engages people for a longer period of time. And when people feel that they've had a good welcome and they understand what's being asked of them, they understand the rules, if you will, and all of that, I just see volunteers have such a better experience. Is that your experience as well?
Yes and no. I think onboarding is an important step, but following up on that initial onboarding and making sure that what you promise in that onboarding and the environment you create in that onboarding is actually reflected in all levels of your organization. I think young people today are also very conscious of when an organization isn't being truthful and what they're able to offer and what the actual environment is like, what the culture is like. They can sense like fakeness in a way. And so that very quickly can turn away one young person. And as I mentioned, youth voice really matters today because it's so viral. And obviously that's not something you want to be creating. So onboarding is very important. It's really that first interaction with a young person that can set the tone for the rest of the relationship, which hopefully you're able to continue that tone. But yeah, in my experience, creating a sense of community is the biggest thing an organization can do to retain a young person because yes, they do come to have a tangible impact, but at the end of the day, what's going to create that emotional tie to the work and to the organization they're doing work with is that they feel like they're a part of friendships of a family. They feel like they're really integrated, and youth look for that sense of connection a lot of the time. And that's what I saw through Champions of Change, through the programs we delivered at Pillar, was creating an environment where they can bond with each other, they can bond with mentors. Not only helps them achieve higher impact and be more engaged in the program, but also retains them for a longer period of time. When you think about youth, they're going through, especially from grade 8 to university, post university, going through so much growth and so much change, whether it's in the friends they surround themselves with, the city they're in. So it's hard to retain youth for long periods of time. So being aware of that, like number one, you're not going to keep a youth volunteer for like 5, 6, 7 years
Mhm.
realistically. Um, Being aware of that shorter term engagement is super important, but understanding that to create and retain volunteers, the biggest and most important thing you can do is create that sense of community and that emotional buy-in, which starts from the onboarding process. And I'll give a really quick example. One of the programs that I first participated in when I was like 13 at the very beginning of my high school experience. An activity they did with us was hide and seek in Pillars Innovation Work building, which is a huge, like 4-story apartment style building, co-working space. And I remember that just like genuinely creating relationships and friendships. And that group of youth kept coming back. And because we had built those bonds, it's almost like we're pushing each other forwards and we're in this together. So that's my biggest piece of advice when you're onboarding is create that sense of community right off the bat.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice there. And what would you say, you spoke a lot about governance, Paul, and, I think there's a lot of boards that are sitting around scratching their heads saying, how are we going to engage more volunteers, from a wholesome perspective? And then particularly talking about, youth in particular. I think there's a lot of people that have the wrong sentiment, that it's going to be, it's too much, it's too difficult, we don't have the resources. Inspire someone today to think differently.
Yeah, I mean, this is hard, right? Because the sector is struggling. So I don't think I have a silver bullet or a panacea, but we presented on this subject yesterday through our own network, through Pillar Nonprofit Network, and we had breakout sessions. Aditi, again, like, I'm such a fan. She had a panel of young people who presented on a variety of topics, and then we did breakout sessions where people got to talk to the various youth panelists. And I just sort of popped in. To kind of listen in. And so I heard a volunteer coordinator with a local organization, well established local organization, does fantastic programming in food education, and and she said that they do want to have more teens involved because their programming is sort of centered on younger children and on families. And they wanted to have more teens involved, but they only had a couple, and they couldn't really think of like how to program for more. And I just suggested, so I don't know if this be helpful for anybody in the audience today, anybody who subsequently accesses this recording. I don't know if Aditi's going to call me out on this, because I was thinking aloud then and I'm thinking aloud again. And I do get myself into trouble. But I just suggested, like, maybe the first volunteer opportunity that you can offer to teens beyond what you've got now, and the highly interested people who found their way to you already, is to ask them to recruit a couple of friends, right? To establish that space where they're a community doing something together, and have them pitch you ideas about how teens could be more involved in the program. Have them design something that seems like a legitimate volunteer activity. It might be an on-ramp for, one or more of them to eventually do some paid work for you, right? Because we always have to watch that line, what we're asking people to do. And at the same time that we're becoming more attuned to an equitable and safe space for volunteerism, we're becoming more, as a sector, we're embracing our accountability for safe and ethical workspaces too, and making sure that we really understand that although some of those things have had a history of fluidity, there need to be some pretty good guardrails between volunteering and things that ought to be paid work. Aditi talks about a different way of creating the overlap, the Venn diagram there, which is recognizing the value of volunteerism, possibly through some sort of economic reward. This could spit me out into an entirely different. So I'm going to let it do that. I'm going to pick up a tangent, and then try to find my way back to the answer. But and the tangent is to say that volunteerism, because we haven't really talked about this. I mean, volunteerism, the way that it's been traditionally understood in the sector, is a very colonial structure, right? It's one of two kinds of giving that you can do. You can give time and talent, or you can give money, right? So it's volunteerism and philanthropy are these paired concepts in a colonial sort of understanding of how, and it's no accident we say gives back, how one gives back to the community, because the assumption is that you've been able to extract or at least enjoy prosperity and opportunity from that community, and you're trying to return some of it as a kind of tithe, right? And so it's really embedded in its origins in that sort of colonial and overlapping with religious heritage of our country. And it's really important to understand that there are so many models of community care. There's so many different ways in which it can be understood. So we do have people who live here now. We have, communities from places that don't talk about volunteerism because the idea of returning value to the community is built right into your everyday life. It's not a separate activity. It's something that's embedded in the way that you do work, right? And we know that the original peoples of the land that we're living on also had a model of community care that didn't separate out community care from your everyday role in your society. So going all the way back to things that maybe pick up on some of the things that Aditi's talking about a different sort of approach to volunteerism. I mean, one of the ways to talk about it is a transformation of volunteerism itself. Another way to think about it in tandem is to say we've learned a lot from other people. And we've learned a lot, and we've been willing to learn a lot from other people about how you participate in community care. It doesn't have to look the way it always looked before. And so, yeah, so coming back to the sort of granular answer, yeah, I mean, possibly for some people, and I think it was the case for this volunteer coordinator I was speaking to, maybe the answer, if you're really just not sure where to start, is find a way to engage young people in answering the question for you and giving you some ideas. Starting with those two that they already have, can each of them invite a friend or somebody they think would be interested? Maybe it's not a friend. Maybe they get to build their community by saying, hey, we've never talked before, but I know you're really interested in food security. Yeah. I work for this organization as a volunteer, and we're kind of thinking like maybe there should be a role for young people in it, but they're not sure what to do with us. So you want to help me figure it out? And that might be one way to go.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I'm going to remind everybody in a couple of minutes, we're going to take some questions in the Q&A, and we've already see one there. We see one in the chat. Really encourage you to include your questions. I get to ask all mine, but we want to hear from you. You've always got some great questions in terms of our participants today. So don't be shy to do that. I'm going to ask one more question of Aditi, and then we'll go to those questions in the Q&A. Aditi, what are the biggest sort of hurdles do you think for youth when they reach out to an organization? Give me a sense of if someone's really passionate about something, they reach out, are they getting called back? Are they able to engage quickly? Are they able to work on their time frame? Is it the work that they want to do? Help me understand that a bit more.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges that they're facing today is information is not where youth are. So youth are on social media, youth are not on traditional platforms like websites, Facebook, etc. So a lot of organizations make that first mistake of not going to youth. So ensuring that I think what Paul said is so, so relevant is that you have to understand youth perspective, and you can't get that without engaging with youth from the very first step, which is planning and designing programming. And a lot of the time, if you do engage youth at every step of creating a new program or initiative or whatever it is you're working on that you want youth to engage with, you need to have them involved from the very beginning. That's the first misstep I see happen. And then for a young person, when we go to engage with an organization, there's challenges in scheduling. Like that's a very small, granular item, but we're in school, we have classes, things get busy with exam periods, and a lot of organizations aren't flexible and adaptable enough to understand that. And so that is what a lot of youth have come to me and said is that we appreciate you running your stuff in the evening and what works for us, and understanding that the nature of our lives isn't the same as someone who's graduated university or high school. It's different. And so understanding that. And again, that comes from talking to youth, from planning when your sessions are going to happen, when your meetings are going to happen, and ensuring that you have that flexibility. Another thing is freedom of choice in what you're doing and being able to get youth to use their creative mind. A lot of young people today have ideas, have voices, have perspective that they want to share, but there aren't the avenues in companies and organizations to use that voice and to activate it. And so that's another big barrier that youth face when trying to engage in volunteerism, is that there's no mechanism and there are no pathways for them to activate their idea. The third thing I want to talk about is decision-making power. So think this goes back to engaging youth in every step of your planning, but when a youth joins an organization, one of the most important things that will motivate them to stay involved and to see the value of their work is feedback. And a lot of that feedback can be shown through implementing solutions that they have or ideas that they have, and creating an environment where that power structure that exists between, like, let's say, an older paid employee and a volunteer uh, is there, but isn't as uh, isn't as much of a barrier for a young person to share a new idea, especially if they want to shift the way an organization operates. As a young person, it can be very scary to enter an environment where you're working with like 40-year-olds and you've never like spoke up in a meeting, you don't know how to interact, you don't know how to make a suggestion, you don't know how they operate. And so creating an environment where that power structure is broken down and you can make them feel like their input is being valued and that they're having a tangible impact. And so that decision making power is a huge aspect that a lot of youth don't have and should should have, and I think will further the quality of work that all the organizations looking to engage you want to do.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant. We've got a couple of questions. We'll go first to the Q&A and then we'll head to the chat. My buddy from beautiful Russell, Doug Anthony, is asking, what are the best opportunities for a nonprofit organization that can offer to attract youth to volunteers? So what are they looking for, Paul?
Yeah, I think Aditi just answered
Yeah.
that. As I say, like brilliantly. But yeah, I mean, I think there is this, sort of at the moment of attraction. I am going to just reiterate some of the things that Aditi said in a different order, I guess, to address the question. But think about, like, are you where young people are? Are you where the young people you want to attract are? Are you showing up in those spaces? And are you, maybe something that we haven't talked about, like, are you demonstrating who you are in those spaces? So are you going on to TikTok and saying, like, we need volunteers? Or are you going on to TikTok and telling stories and creating reels? Are you going to Instagram and TikTok and telling stories and creating reels that demonstrate who you are, so that young
Mhm.
people might, like, be curious about you already, kind of want to know
Right.
who you are, be involved with you, and then you can ask. Or just, you don't not even have to ask. You can just say that there's opportunities. You can say that there's lots of ways to be involved with us, right? Volunteering would be one of them. So I think that's, so partly, like, be where young people are, be your true attractive self. Like, if you think you have opportunities for young people that ought to be attractive to young people, well, be that, be transparent, be yourselves. And you'll have a better time onboarding and retaining volunteers and getting, like, real investment from those people in your organization if you turn out to be, as Aditi said, if you turn out to be who you said you were,
Right.
right? So yeah, so tell people who you are in an honest way that you're going to be able to maintain, that you can support, your culture and your governance structures are actually supporting, that whatever you say that you are, it's in your job roles, it's in your budgets, it's in the places that guarantee that you're going to maintain that over time, not just telling a story.
Mhm.
So I'd say that, and then as Aditi said, like, then you have to follow up. You have to be who you said you were.
Yeah.
And I
Perfect.
think that, and if you create an environment in which people think that they have decision-making power, that they have community, that they're having an impact, that's being reported back to them, that they're being told, they're being included
Mhm.
in stories of impact,
Yeah.
um, then I think, in that respect, it's not really that different from attracting, hiring, and retaining paid workers too, right?
Exactly.
That's kind of what we want as humans. It's what we deserve as humans. And the fact that we've, had inequitable and will continue to have some inequities around power for younger people. If you can reduce those barriers, reduce those divisions of power, and create opportunities for shared power, I think that's the best thing you can do.
I think I love what you talked about, the sharing the impact back to them, because I think it has to be a two-way conversation from certainly from my perspective. We have a question in the chat, which I'll share now. This is from Jim Birch. Hi, Jim. Thanks so much for submitting the question. How do we have continuity in a youth engagement project? So the example here, Aditi, is we have worked with high school students, but it's often grade 12 students, then they graduate. Should we persuade the school to create a school club, for instance, as a way of engaging people maybe a little bit earlier in their high school career? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I talked about before is that young people are going through so many different stages of life, and realistically, you're not going to keep the same young person year over year over year. But your goal should be during the time that you do get to interact with them to help them build the skills, to help them explore their passions. And so, in terms of continuity, clubs is a really great way to do that. However, you do need a young person to champion that. You can't just go to school and say, hey, start my club. You need the passion to come from the students. And so, Paul talked about finding one or two students and asking them to ask their friends. That's kind of the model I took with the nonprofit that I started a few years ago that got a lot of traction is we started in the schools. And a lot of the time we recruit from putting up posters in guidance counselor offices and sharing with teachers because that's where the youth are is schools. And so for continuity, creating a club that can go year over year is really, really a great idea. But you have to make sure that within that club, you provide the right supports, the right infrastructure. Another thing for continuity that I talk about a lot is mentorship. So, the model that we took at Champions of Change is every year there's a changeover in leadership. But what we do is a lot of hands-on mentorship towards the latter end of the year so that youth who are going to be taking on leadership roles the next year are learning from youth who are in those leadership roles in the current year. So that could be grade 12s training grade 11s and that kind of cyclical model happening year over year. And that's a very self-sustaining thing for your organization to implement because then you don't have to be every year going in training new people. It's kind of like youth teaching other youth.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they're most responsive to that.
Yeah, we're going through that in this house right now, actually. My daughter is the co-chair for the relay event. And so she's got a grade 12 sort of mentoring her. She's in grade 11, and then she'll move up in that time and be the head next year. So that, it's a brilliant model. So I love that question. We have a follow-up question from Doug Anthony. So his question is, this is such a great question. Paul, how do we best prepare our current members to accept youth and the changes that will ensue? Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's my job when Aditi and I do this together. Like that's kind of like my role because Aditi's brilliant on the engagement questions and even when I get a good idea like hey invite your friends, it's because I've learned from my own community development, but also more recently from listening to Aditi and her colleagues in the organizations that she's also incubated and mentored. Yeah, so this is, as I say, so there's a couple of things, and I think I sort of opened with this in my introduction. I'll go back to that a little bit, which is, there's a human rights kind of issue around engagement and involvement in the governance of your lives, right? There's a civil rights kind of argument around that too. That we ought to be sharing power, according privilege to people where we can for them to be engaged and involved. And then there's the necessity argument, right? And this is the one where, like, if you dig into the data, this is and sort of think about the ecosystem. This is the one that's where the volunteers are now, right? So you can you can take any of those tacks with any organization and figure out like what's going to be the fit there, right? So some people are going to be very receptive to the idea that you want young people to tell you how to how to guide and govern your own organization for sustainability, because they're the ones who will in fact be the staff and the community of that organization, and they have a role to play in that. You know, and you can take that kind of like rights and responsibilities sort of perspective. Like everybody should have a role to play, you know, and everybody from the community is a stakeholder. I don't love that term, you know, but should be interested in our progress. And then you can take the it's rough. It's really rough right now. Think about your own organization. You know, do you have enough reserves to last a few more years right now after coming out of the pandemic? You know, what does your volunteer ecosystem look like now? Are you covering? Have you dropped services because you don't have enough volunteers? What's the you know, what is the cost of living doing to you at the organizational level? Are your costs going up? Are you able to afford to offer the services that you do? What's your pay structure look like? You know, are you offering decent work already? How many cost of living increases do you think you're going to have to issue this year? What's that going to cost you? You know, can you afford not to have volunteers? And if you can't afford not to have volunteers that are, again, performing legitimate volunteer roles, but, you know, if your organization's total capacity is going to depend on some giving back, some volunteerism, some, you know, incorporation of other models, mutual aid and community care, where are they going to come from? Because your super volunteers, you know, your baby boomer super volunteers are aging out and retiring, and it doesn't look like they're coming back, right? You know, like Volunteer Toronto just did a really interesting study with Meals on Wheels programs across the province, concentrated in the GTA, but right across the province. And it's a great report. It's really interesting, and it basically says it's an unsustainable system. Like you won't be able to run indefinitely on principally senior drivers as your business model and service delivery model going forward. You're not going to be able to replace them.
Wow.
Yeah, you're in trouble, right? Unless you change something. And changing something can be lots of things. It can be, you know, new last mile solutions, bike brigades, like there's all kinds of things you could change, but like your model isn't going to work anymore in the long term. So, you know, where are your volunteers going to come from? Well, who's interested in being involved in the community? Young people. Young people are really interested in being involved in the community. Like they want to take an active role. So, and how do you prepare organizations to sort of accept that that's the next iteration necessity? If you can't prepare them on a human rights or civil rights argument, then you know, this is what you're going to get. Is, you know, the people who are going to be coming to volunteer, if you're asking for volunteers, they're going to be young. Then there's a B to that question. Like, how do you prepare for the changes that ensue by really giving, you know, young people a role in your organization? And if I can pitch it, because I know this is your job, Sam, I'd flip the part B to Aditi, because that's like, she lives that.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to take your thoughts on that. And we have one more question, Aditi, I want to make sure we get to by the end. So we've got about 5 minutes, but happy to take your thoughts on that as well.
Um, hmm. Yeah, I mean, to me, I think that youth are really looking for learning and those experiences. And so offering those experiences where it aligns with their learning, and where that community care and social responsibility is no longer like an optional thing. It's ingrained in their everyday life and ingrained in all the work that they're doing. I think that's really at the forefront. And that was something that I saw reflected in all the programming that I ran is when you're able to align learning and this kind of, I talk a lot about reciprocal value in the workshop that we did yesterday. And reciprocal value, not just in a sense of uh, economic value, but there's so many different ways that you can honor youth and volunteers for their time, whether it's through awards, through training. Something that we did is an art program where youth were creating environmentally inspired pieces of art for a local bike repair shop. And so the value that they provided was this bike repair shop got all this free art, but what we were able to provide in return was training from a professional artist who came and taught them all these different mechanisms to create art. And so there are many different ways to provide that learning and reciprocal value. But one that I'm a huge fan of is the like honorarium or award slash scholarship model, because that really helps break down barriers for youth, as I mentioned, who have to work to support their families, have to work to support themselves. So funding is hard for a lot of social innovation, social activism, and nonprofits. But I think that if you have the chance to get the funding to support youth through an economic lens, do it. Like that is the most best way to break down barriers.
Yeah, wonderful. I'll get your thoughts too, Aditi. This is a question that's come from Vanessa Beelan. Vanessa, thanks for the question. Her comments are, my organization is always looking to engage more youth to volunteer. Yay, that's awesome. However, what are some of the legal risk management considerations in offering them volunteer opportunities? Do you want to answer this one, Aditi?
Around legal engaging young people. Yeah, I mean, I can do a quick little answer
Sure.
to this because I haven't interacted a lot with the legal sides of engaging with young people.
Great.
But I know there's a lot in terms of media distribution and pictures that you have to consider, like when you engage a young person, ensuring that you have those photo release forms. Those are very basic things that a lot of organizations do, just to ensure that they have like parents and guardians who are able to sign off on the photos and the release forms. Um, but also recognizing something that's maybe not so much on the legal side, but on the infrastructure side is transportation. And so understanding like where youth are coming from and how you can support them in that transportation, especially for evening events, especially if you're in like your city center, downtown, can be hard for youth to get to and from. And so understanding and having the support to understand where all these different little pieces come from a legal perspective is also very important. And it also depends what age you're engaging with. Obviously, if you're engaging with someone 18 and above, it's not as relevant to have that legal infrastructure for photos and permission forms. But if it's somebody who's in high school or elementary school, you need to ensure that you have the parent or guardian sign off and buy-in from that lens. But I'm also a big fan of youth taking their own agency to get that approval and that buy-in. And so encouraging like communication directly with youth, but then on top of that, getting informed and et cetera, is what I like to see versus parents handling all the emails, which you then take away a level of control away from young people.
Yeah, agreed. There's a part two to the question. Maybe I'll send it to Paul. We only have about a minute, Paul, but the part two to the question is, what style of opportunities have you seen work well for teens and young adults in terms of this question? So some of the background on the opportunities for her org provides public event tabling, event hosting, fundraising, etc.
Yeah, so I mean, I think those are things that are, that we commonly see happen, right? We see young people engaged in sort of like one-off events, or serial events. I think that like that's fine. Um, and I would just add that around the legal questions, there are liability waivers. Similarly, I think Dee Dee's idea of best practices around letting you sort of shepherd that process is really important. And then there's federal frameworks, provincial frameworks, municipal frameworks, volunteer code itself would have the answer to some of these. So professional standards, industry norms. So Volunteer Canada would be like a really good source for some of that stuff. But yeah, in terms of the opportunities themselves, I mean, I think that like those are good opportunities, those are fine, and they can be fun in themselves. But I think that those that kind of longer term rewarding experience that's going to make a young person part of your community in an ongoing way. I think those are, where you need to think about and engage youth in designing those experiences. What do young people think about your cause area and about the best ways and about the kinds of programs you deliver and what the best ways to engage them would be. And so thinking about how to create a space where young people could tell you how they want to be engaged with you is probably like, that's again the first and best volunteer opportunity you could give them. And then they may give you ideas about
Mm-hmm.
you could actually do, you could actually fund, and there are opportunities. I guess I'll just like finish up that answer with this to say, it's all well and good for me to say, have youth design a program for you as a volunteer opportunity, and then knowing that like the kinds of other constraints that we operate under in the sector, is that going to be funded? Does it make sense to invite youth to design a program that you're kind of only pretending you could do anything about? But there are opportunities. I'm thinking of like OTF funds, like various kinds of seed grants, very like like small scale grants that could just let you pilot something like that, where youth could say, and you can tell them that you can say, if we could get $1,000, $2,000, $1,500, to let you get started on something, what would that something look like if you wanted to work with us? And that might be a good opportunity to engage youth in kind of designing a program that's sustainable.
Wonderful. I cannot believe that hour flew by. I feel like that was 5 minutes. There's so much that you provided, though. I think it was a good use of time for our participants today. Certainly, I learned a lot. Thank you both. Aditi, thank you so much for joining us all the way from beautiful Portugal and spending time with us. Safe travels to you. And Paul, thank you so much for joining us from beautiful Ottawa. To all of our participants today, thank you so much. I know you were all engaged. Lots of great questions. We look forward to next month. I'm Sam Laprade. This is the Capacity Building Institute, and it's been my honor to spend time. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.